speaking and hand over to Lauren. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to share this presentation and I'm going to give you the presentation at the end. So, because there's a lot to go over. I'm going to be speaking for about an hour and then I'll have questions. So, but if I fly over something, remember you can ask me questions about it. And you can see the deck. And I am here for you. You can have my email address. You can email me questions. I'm serious about that. So don't get overwhelmed if I'm going to be, because there's a lot we can go over. So I might be going over some of this stuff kind of fast. Okay, first, let's start podcast marketing 101. Why I'm really glad you're here is because I always say if a perfect podcast drops without a marketing plan, does it make a sound? Maybe not. You and your team could spend so many hours producing a great podcast, but if you're not smart about your marketing, or maybe if you don't even think about marketing, there's literally a chance that no one will hear it. I think a lot of podcasters think that a podcast gets distributed somewhere, and I can see why they might think that, but it really doesn't. There's a chance no one will hear it if you don't market it. So I always tell people, please spend 50% of your time marketing, and no one ever does that. 50% of the time, the podcast marketing. And I know that that's a lot to ask, but if you're just think about how much time you're spending making it. It'd be such a shame if nobody heard it. This is me. These are my newsletters, and then tinkmedia.co is my website, and I can share that more with you at the end. I put Twitter on here, but I'm kind of Twitter, RIP, very sad. I used to love Twitter. I don't know what social media I'm on anymore. I'm on Reddit all the time, but the best way to find me is really my website or just my email if you have questions after this. So really quick up top, I want to talk about how, there's marketing tactics I'm going to talk about to get your show out there, but there's things you can do with your actual work and your show. And one thing I want to address is if I was going to give someone advice about who is starting a show in a month or 2 months or a year or anything of their own, and maybe this is some of you who have a dream project you want to start someday, I would start building your audience now. That's your best bet. And one way to do that is a newsletter. I recommend making a newsletter for everyone. It doesn't, I hope this doesn't intimidate anyone because it doesn't have to be an issue every single week, but have a hub and start building the list and say, I'm going to be having some exciting stuff. If you're a fan of me, a fan of my work, please sign up. There will be things coming soon. You don't have to have any issues at all. But building the list is important because that's a list you own. You don't own your Apple Podcast list. People could subscribe to your podcast once you launch it and then come and go away and you'll have no idea who they were. But this email list that you'll be collecting addresses, those are people that you own. Also, you can't really have even an Apple Podcasts link until you have the trailer up, and you might not have a trailer yet. So building a list and an audience first is so important. Then when you have something, you'll already have people that'll be so excited to listen to it. Also, add specific heartfelt call to actions at the beginning of every show. I would say as a listener, I often get, I hear a million things like leave me a rating and a review, sign up for a newsletter, follow me on social media, tell a friend, whatever, all this stuff. I would pick one or two calls to action and focus on them. And you can test them out. Maybe you try one call to action for a while and then you switch it up. If you're trying to build your newsletter list, focus on that. If you want people to leave you a comment or a rating and review, you're trying to build up your reviews, focus on that. And also try to make it sound different. I hear so many times when I'm listening, leave me a rating and review, that it kind of washes through my brain. If you can think of a more specific way to ask people to do that, it's better. And in fact, I think sometimes people want to leave a review for a show, an Apple Podcast or Spotify or whatever, and they just can't think of something to say. And I know it's silly, but sometimes you just don't want to spend a lot of time thinking, but you don't know what to say, but you do want to leave something. Maybe you can tell people what to say or give them a prompt or say, ask me a question. Or, I was just talking to someone who had a Taylor Swift podcast and I was like, ask them to put their favorite Taylor Swift song in the review. Just say, leave me a review. It doesn't matter what they say. You just need them to say something. So help them leave a rating and review. And I must say, on a lot of podcasts, I hear podcasters say, leave me a rating and review. It really helps in the algorithm. It doesn't. That's not true. It's on the Apple Podcasts website. It does not help in the algorithm. What gets you high in the algorithm is getting a lot of listens. But it still is really good to have a lot of ratings and reviews. If I go to a show that doesn't have any, I'm like, what? You didn't even ask your friends? Your team didn't even leave a rating and review. A rating and review is social proof. It's like when you go into a dive bar and it says Lauren Passell was here on the wall. It means somebody was there. It's a populated place. So think of it that way. It's really good to have them, but they're not going to help you in the algorithm. Also, a few other things. If you have a large inventory of things and you kind of people could maybe get lost coming to your show, I would on your web have a website that says like laurenpassell.com/start here. And then start here could be a starter pack, right? Of guiding people where to begin. And then on the show, I can just go, hey, go to laurenpassell.com/start here for your starter pack. That's like one way to really help people get in. Also, if you have an episode that's really, really great or a series that's really, really great, make a trailer for it and put it on your own show. And don't be afraid to use old content. I consider this marketing. Had a client one time that I found out that she had, the best year ever, but she had reused 80% of her content from earlier. I mean, she repackaged it, she turned it into new things, but I often talk to podcasters that get on this hamster wheel of the stress of having to make new content all the time. You don't, especially if you're marketing right, you're getting new listeners all the time. They haven't heard your old stuff. So it's okay to repeat content as long as you're clear with your audience. Audiences just want honesty and transparency with you. They want to get to know you. They want to know who you are, and they want to know, they don't want to be lied to. Have I heard this episode before? I think I have. You should tell them. Yeah, this is I'm playing this again. This is a favorite episode, or, some of this is you might have heard before. Just tell them what's going on. And oh man, I really could talk about this for a long time, but I want to move on. Another good tip I consider this marketing because running a survey will help you learn about your audience. And it's really, really important. So if you have been building up an audience before you start your podcast, you could run a survey there. Or I think if you have had a podcast for a year, you could start a survey. I don't think enough people do this. There's some questions that I always like to use. There's a really good article called that Tom Webster wrote for, I think it was Sounds Profitable, called What We Talk About When We Talk About Podcasting. It has some really good questions in it, and this links to it. So when I send you the slideshow, you can read the article yourself. But it's like the importance of having a survey and the many things you can ask. Okay, this is what we're really here to talk about. And the stuff on the left is where we're going to begin. This is your marketing and PR toolbox. The stuff on the left is stuff that it's not, okay, it's important. It's not my very, very, very favorite stuff. It works in many ways. It's not important, but I'm just saying the stuff on the right is like really, really fun and I absolutely love it. So we'll talk about that later. So just get excited about that stuff. But stuff on the left, let's talk about that first. Media features. When I say that, I mean I get clients that are like, I want to be in the New York Times, or sometimes they want to be in Variety or something like that. Just general traditional media features. That can also be like podcast newsletters, and we're going to get into that too. In-app features, that's like when Apple Podcasts, when you open up Apple Podcasts and you see there's carousels and curated lists, you can pitch yourself to be featured there. And that's a really, really actually important thing to do. And that can be a game changer for some podcasts. If they have a prominent feature on Apple Podcasts, we're going to talk about that, but I'll tell you why it's not ride or die, or I'm not ride or die for it. Paid advertising, we're going to talk about that a little bit too. And then social media. And all of these things, I say it might get you a spike because a lot of these things, like if you pay money for advertising, you're going to get a spike, which means you got in front of some of the wrong people. Some of the right people, some of the wrong people, because you need people to stick around, and a lot of times they don't. Same with an in-app feature. A lot of times with clients, if they get featured by Apple Podcasts, you see this huge spike and then it goes down again. You don't often see it just continue to go up. So that's why they're not my favorite things. It's like they work, they're good, they're not for nothing. But the stuff on the right, that we're going to talk about later, is more slow and constant growth. It's organic, and it's more it's a little bit more work, but I think it pays off in the long run. But we're going to get into these things now. So paid advertising, this is funny. This slide used to have more stuff on it. That is because I used to have this big list of places I would tell people to spend money. And by the way, I don't think you have to spend money, but hey, if you have money, I have very strong feelings about where to spend it. Sometimes clients come to me and they have a budget and they want me to spend it. So I do a lot of testing. There were all these services, there's some apps you can use, which means, you can have an advertisement on apps, not Apple Podcasts, but like Overcast and Castbox. Maybe you're familiar with those apps. I would say Overcast is, maybe I shouldn't have deleted them from the slide. They used to be on the slide. But Overcast is an app that you can use. It can be kind of expensive. Castbox is actually the app that people like the most to spend money on, because it's the only one that has a guarantee, which means they won't take your ad down until you reach the lift that you paid for, which is great. But I think, and then there's something called Mopod I used to recommend, which was a website that they would basically put a player on a website that gave you downloads and drove people to your podcast. But the more I play around with a lot of these, places to spend money, I find they're not actually genuine listeners. Like Mopod, a lot of those places that'll place a player on a website, those end up being not real downloads. Sometimes literally bots, they're counting those as downloads. And often I find that those listeners don't stick. Same with when you spend money in a podcast app, I just find that they don't always stick. You can spend money on them, but it's kind of like Ozempic. It's like you have to keep on spending for it to actually stick. So it's not my favorite way to spend money, but you can do it. I literally have clients that need to get to a large download number in a short amount of time. And I'm like, go to Castbox. They'll do it for you. However, there are better ways to spend money, I think, if I had money to spend. And that would be, buying ads in newsletters, I must say, is extremely cheap. No one does it. If I had money though, I'd spend it on promos and feed drops. You have to go to where the podcast listeners are. You have to do the research to find the right audience overlap. And when I say this, promos and feed drops, that means finding podcasts. We're going to talk about this more, but where you think your ideal listeners are listening. Okay, I call those your podcast friends. Where is your audience? What shows are they listening to? And maybe you learned this by doing a survey, but going to those shows and asking for their rate cards and saying, how much would you charge for me to drop the first episode of my new show into your feed? Or how much would you charge to do a 30-second promo, an advertisement basically for my show? That is how I would spend money, because you've done the work, you've found the right audience, you're letting them hear it. They're already podcast listeners. I think that's the best way to spend money. Getting featured. Now, I talked about Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and how you can pitch yourself to be featured in these places. I'm going to talk about the Apple Podcast process right now, but they're all kind of the same. Just to be specific there. They're basically Airtables. You can link when you get this spreadsheet, or it's on the Apple Podcast website, obviously, but they're Airtables. So keep that in mind. You're doing a pitch letter basically in a form. But keep in mind that someone is reading this, a real person, and it kind of gets spit out into a Excel spreadsheet. Sorry, I thought my music was playing. So imagine someone's reading the back of a Excel spreadsheet. You want your copy to pop in that spreadsheet when you're writing this pitch letter for, it's basically a pitch letter in a form. So there's a few things to know about this. First of all, I wouldn't do it for every episode. I would do it every 3 to 4 months, maybe, only when you have something really important and when you really believe that you should be featured. And in this pitch, when you're trying to get, someone to do this, you have to explain to someone at Apple Podcasts why now? That's what they want to know. The feeds like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, they want their feeds to look kind of like it's like a news feed, right? They want things that are relevant, they want things that are timely, they want big names. So if you have one of those things, that's when I would pitch, and that's when what I would, really, really use as my pitching point. And if Halloween is coming up or something, or Mother's Day, and you could make an episode catering to that content and it doesn't seem inauthentic to you and your show, I would do it because people are going to be looking for that stuff. Blog writers, podcast writers, everybody's going to be looking for content that's timely and stuff. So if you can, do it. They like to know 2 weeks in advance. So if you're launching a show, I would pitch 2 months in advance, at least. Two very important, and don't submit the same thing every single time. There are two very important fields on this form that I want to point out. Most of it is pretty self-explanatory, but there's two fields. First of all, one of the fields says which region, and most people put like UK, or a lot of people put the US, US and UK are the two top places that people put in that section, because they're thinking, well, I'm podcasting in the US or I'm podcasting in the UK, so I'm going to choose that as my field. If you're starting out, maybe don't choose that as your field. Those are the most crowded places to be pitching. I would pitch in a different country. There's other countries that speak the language of the podcast, and even if they don't, they might still be interested in the podcast. By the way, if you have the podcast already and you're pitching, look at your analytics and see what other countries people are listening from. Pitch those countries, or just take a guess. I'm going to guess Australia, maybe Belgium, Ireland. Like, just think what makes sense. Sometimes a lot of business podcasts, India, go, because you have a much higher chance of getting featured in another country. Then you can say, I was featured on Apple. No one cares what country it was. And you have a higher chance of getting featured in the UK or a bigger market if you can get tested in these smaller markets. So, like, I had a USA road trip podcast, and casually, the host of it, he was a client of mine. He mentioned that he had a lot of listeners in Italy, and I was like, that's weird. So I was like, okay, I guess you have listeners in Italy. I pitched him to Italy, and he got featured in Italy. So keep that in mind. There's another field I want you to pay attention to, and it basically says something like, tell us about your marketing plan or something. They don't want to know about your marketing plan. What that field should say is, we are Apple Podcasts. If we feature you, we are going to be doing you a big favor. What are you going to do for us? We're a company too. So what they want to know is, how are you going to support Apple Podcasts? This is where you say, I am going to tell people on my podcast to listen on Apple Podcasts. I'm going to make a social media post, and this is how many followers I have, and I'm going to be linking to the Apple Podcast link and tagging Apple. I'm going to be linking to Apple Podcasts in my newsletter. I have the Apple Podcast button on my website. Whatever you can say to show that you're being a good partner, driving people to the Apple Podcast app. That's what they want to know. How will you promote Apple Podcasts? And remember, this stuff might cause a spike, but it's not necessarily constant growth, and it can be a blessing or a curse. I had a friend who had a comedy podcast once that was featured on Apple Podcasts, but it was a very weird kind of sense of humor, and people didn't really get it. And so a lot of people came in and listened. She got a humongous spike, but they didn't like it. So they left bad reviews and then never listened again. So she got a spike, then went down to the same number that she had before, but just had a lot of negative reviews she couldn't get rid of. So keep that in mind. Okay. Social media. I don't want to spend too much time here because social media does not drive growth almost always. And when anyone ever says anything for sure about podcast marketing, you should always ask, because nothing is really for sure. But I can say with almost complete certainty that it doesn't. So I'm always trying to get people to spend less time on social media. it's good for the audience you are growing. It's good for your community, but it's not going to get new audiences. Sometimes when I say this to people, someone will be like, that's not true. I got a lot of likes on my tweets. And I'm like, congratulations. That means you have friends that are like, you go girl. They're liking your tweet. They're not new people and they might not even be listening. Someone will say, that's not true. I had a TikTok that went viral. I'm like, congratulations. That sounds awesome. If going viral on TikTok or having a TikTok is your goal, that's great. But prove to me that those people listened to your podcast. I don't think you can. And then every once in a while, when I tell people this, that someone will say, oh, thank God. And I'm like, okay, here's someone that just wants to make a good show. They want to spend their time making a good podcast. That's how I know. There's a bunch of reasons for this. One of the reasons, and this is actually really important, so I hope everyone's listening right now. It's very hard to convert a non-listener to a listener. So when you're marketing, think about that. I don't really waste a lot of time pitching to places like magazines where there's not a lot of podcast listeners because it's really hard. Have you ever tried to get someone who doesn't listen to podcasts to listen to a podcast? It's very hard. It's not impossible. I don't want to waste my time doing it. That's why I go after the podcast listening apps, pitching my clients to podcast listening apps, pitching my clients to podcast newsletters, trying to get my clients' shows in the ears of other podcast listeners by, getting other podcasters to mention them on their podcasts, pitching my clients to be interviewed on other podcasts because you want them in front of podcast listeners. It's just too hard to convert. So social media, you're getting maybe a lot of people that don't listen to podcasts, so they're not going to. Also, algorithms typically don't favor things that send people to other websites, but here's a huge reason. When I'm on TikTok, if I see an ad for podcast, I'm not leaving TikTok to go listen to your podcast. People don't want to leave TikTok. People don't want to leave the platform they're on. So they're not going to leave a platform to go listen to your podcast. I also, please do not spend money on social media advertising. That's something, if there's one thing you could remember, it's that. And the other advice I have is maybe choose one or two platforms and then ignore the rest. It's going to be there, maybe like have a presence on a couple so that people can tag you. If they write, I write newsletters. I write about podcasts. Sometimes I like to tag someone. So pay attention if someone's tagging you, like that post, whatever. Be there so that people can get in contact with you, but don't waste too much time on it. Here's what I would love. Take time away from all that time people are spending on social media and make them use that time instead to pitch themselves to podcast newsletters. We're going to talk about that, but I've got to start moving a little bit quicker. YouTube, I could talk about this for 5 hours. Like it or not, the future is video right now. I talked to a lot of podcasters that are like, wait a second, I got into this business because I don't want to be on video. And I'm like, same girl, but it's important. But the thing is, don't worry about it too much. You don't have to have your whole show on YouTube. What I am learning is YouTube is the biggest search engine there is. So you can think of it as a way to market your podcast by doing shorts, things that people are going to be searching for using SEO, like how to make a peanut butter sandwich. You could make a clip about that, driving people to your episode about peanut butter sandwiches. It can just be for marketing. So I would think about it that way. We kind of talked about this, whether or not reviews matter. Okay, we're going to get to my favorite section now. This is the more organic side of marketing. And once again, it takes more work. You can't just throw money at something. It's not a one-shot form you're filling out. It takes work and is slow growth. But with this kind of stuff, you are going to get in front of the right listeners. And that takes more time, right? And the right listeners are going to come back to you every single time. And they're going to tell all your friends about you. All of their friends about you. They're going to become your biggest advocates. And, maybe the best way to grow a podcast is getting people to tell their friends about you. That's very authentic. So, that's what's going to happen. Speaking of this is kind of back to something we were talking about before. 2 things, actually. Sorry, I'm going a little out of order. A great call to action that I don't hear enough people use to get people to grow their show and share their shows. On the show, say, at the end or the very, very beginning, say, text us to a friend. No one does that. People say, tell your friends about it. It's like when I'm talking about podcasts at a dinner party, no, text this to your friend, tell them to do that. They have their devices in their hands. Text this to a friend who loves a good joke. Text this to a friend who, just lost a pet. Text this to a friend who loves to cook pies. Be really specific. Then you're telling them what to do. The more you can tell your listeners, listen, your listeners love you. They have a parasocial relationship with you. They're investing in you. They're going to do what you say. So be specific with what you want them to do. One other thing about, no, we'll get to that soon. Okay. So what do we want to go to first? Okay. This is why this stuff works. What I'm calling partnerships, the more organic growth. Slow, takes time, takes experimenting and thinking outside of the box. And another thing is okay, so a promo swap, I don't know how familiar everyone is with podcasts, but that's when you hear someone say, hey, if you like this podcast, you'll like this other podcast. And then a feed drop is when there's an entire episode of one show, like the file has been given to another podcaster and they put it on their feed. So when you might see that in your podcast feeds, you'll see an episode of another show randomly there. That's a feed drop. Those work because they feel like personal recommendations from the host or the show. They're free. So if someone's charging you, that's not a partner, that's advertising. So I really like doing them. I like it when podcasts do them. One of my favorite reasons why is it also just makes you an active member in this wonderful community. I have worked in so many kinds of media. I've been working in media for 20 years at least. And I worked old school newspaper, print magazines, dating apps, traditional book publishing. This is the industry where people want to work together and help each other right now. It might change, but take advantage of it while you can. It's a great space to work with others, ask for help others. I'm serious about that. That's why I love my job. Okay, so when these partnerships, right, they all start with working with other podcasts. Okay, so that means you have to find the other podcasts you want to work with. I call those your podcast friends. So there's a couple ways to find your podcast friends. First of all, I would say go to events and webinars and classes like you're in now. Get to know their podcast in this ways. Join listservs. That's one of the best ways to make podcast friends. Ask people what they're working on. The more you do this and you build up who you know, the more you'll know that you can go to and say, hey, I have a show. I think that the audience is similar in this way. I think we should be able to work together. And there's a bunch of different ways you can work together once you find your podcast friend. And I'm going to get into that. But the other thing to think about is this is going to come up a lot. Like when you're looking for a podcast friend, it doesn't just have to be because the shows are a genre match. Okay. If you have a food podcast, don't just go try to find other podcasts that have about food, right? The vibe match is possibly more important. Okay. We contain multitudes. Lauren Passell listens to food podcasts and politics podcasts and music podcasts, all sorts of things. I want a mix. I might not listen to 50 food podcasts, but all the shows that I listen to have a similar vibe. They share my values. So that's why the vibe match is important. So sometimes you might be like, if you have a food show, you might be like, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I think that these shows are similar. I think I should be podcast friends with this show, even though it's not the same topic. This is also what you can learn if you do a survey with your listeners, right? Because you can say, what other shows do you listen to? Actually find out, besides the food podcasts, what else are they listening to? So the vibe matches are important. And an example of a company that does this well is called Multitude. It's a production company. They do a lot of shows, like they have science shows, they have RPG shows, they have regular chat shows. They have a bunch of different kinds of shows. They're not the same genre. But when you listen to them, they feel multitudey, if that makes any sense. It's like a little bit nerdy. It's like very like loving and funny and optimistic. And, you can just kind of tell. So if I listen to one multitude show, and you can look up multitude podcasts, I'm probably going to listen to more because they're my sense of humor and style. Anyway, so that's something to think about when you're looking for these podcast friends. but here are a couple places to find them. First of all, Raphonic. Someone just told me yesterday that Raphonic was like shutting down or something. And I really hope they were lying. I meant to look that up before this class. I think they were just screwing with me because they know how much I love Raphonic. Now, Raphonic is a website that you have to pay for analytics, and it's kind of expensive. But Raphonic.com/graph is free. It is my favorite website. They do not pay me to say this. I should get it tattooed on my arm. Raphonic.com/graph. If you go there right now, you can type in your show, or if you don't have a show yet, or if your show is very small, type in a comp, or just type in any show you like. And it will show you the podcast's universe or neighborhood. Now, this is using Apple Podcasts data to show you what other podcasts are connected. What are listeners of this podcast listening to? Okay. It's very valuable information. This is who you should be working with. This is where your potential listeners are. Now, if you have a show, you can also learn about your listeners, because sometimes I'll go on this website with my clients and they'll be like, I didn't know they listen to so many like science podcasts. There's a bunch of science podcasts on here. So now you know that your listeners listen to science podcasts. That's very valuable information for marketing. Also, I must say, when I show this website to my clients on Zoom, when I'm with them and they do not act excited, my feelings get hurt because I get very excited about raphonic.com/graph. So if you ever talk to me about it, please at least act excited, because I think it's very, very exciting. Listen Notes is kind of like the Wikipedia of podcasts. They have lists. So if you type in a show, it'll give you lists of other shows. Anything that has lists, any websites that have lists with it, you might also like this or whatever. Chartable is going away. I should take this off. That's very, very sad about Chartable going away. Player FM. Okay, this is a hack. Player FM is a podcast listening app, but they have websites with tons of great lists. Okay, so pretend I had a gardening podcast that I was working on. I would literally type into Google, best gardening podcasts, Player FM. I'm serious. It's going to show me a bunch of I guarantee there's a website or a page on Player FM that says best gardening podcast 2024. In fact, I bet if I said best tomato gardening podcasts, Player FM, there'd be a list there. And listen, it's a little, I don't know if this is going to resonate with anyone, but it's a little like shopping at TJ Maxx. When you get these things, you got to there's going to be a whole mess of them. You have to look into them. But what I like about Player FM is when you're looking, right up top, it'll say last episode 4 days ago or last episode 4 years ago. So you know right away, 4 years ago, I'm not even contacting them, but this podcast is clearly still active. So you still have to look into them, but Player FM will build some nice lists for you. Podchaser is another website that will send you lists and has analytics and stuff. It costs money. I think it's good enough to pay for myself, but I have a lot of clients. I don't know if it'd be something you'd ever want to spend money on, but if you ever find yourself in the position of needing to look up good information, I would go with Podchaser. Good Pods is kind of like a listening and social app. Then there's the survey thing I'm mentioning again, and then there's the apps. So if you look up your show on Apple Podcasts and you scroll to the bottom, it's going to say, you might also like this. That's Apple Podcast data telling you basically telling you who your podcast friends should be. Also, oh my God, I always almost forget about this. I love partnerships so much. I just built this database on my website. It is not pretty, I'll say that. I just wanted it to exist so badly that I threw it up on my website, tinkmedia.co. It's free. I just want people to be able to use it. I want people to be able to work together. That's why I built it. Basically, you put your show in there and you put a little bit of data about it, and then you can search other people that have put their data in it. So this is how you can find your podcast friends. The good thing about this is, if you found a show you wanted to do a promo swap with, that's that 30-second advertisement that you'd want to do with each other. And you just emailed them randomly, they might be like, what's a promo swap? And what are we going to do? You might have to do some explaining to them. If you email people in the Tink database, you don't have to. They signed up for this. They know what they're getting. They're waiting for someone to email them. So you can just say, hi, I found you in the Tink database. Do you want to be my podcast friend? Or in fact, I've considered calling it the friendship database because sometimes I meet people at Podcast Movement who say, I met this person in your database and now we co-host a podcast together, or now we're speaking on this panel together. They asked me to be on their panel. It's a good way to meet the people you should be working with to grow your show. But what was I going to say about that? Anyway, you can just go and say, I saw you in the database. Do you want to work together? That's all you have to say. So here's a list of ways you could work with your podcast friends once you find them. There's the promo swap, which is the 30-second, ad read. If you like this show, you might also like this show. There's the feed swap, which means, if I'm doing a feed swap with the podcast American Hysteria, for example, I would put an entire episode of American Hysteria onto my feed and vice versa. There's a crossover episode. I really want to spend a little bit of time on this and like put a little asterisk and hope people remember this crossover episode because I've been having a lot of fun with these lately. So that is like if I'm doing a crossover episode with American Hysteria, maybe that means that I record a conversation with Chelsea, the host, one big conversation, and we split it up and we could put it both on both of our feeds. But what if we only put the first half on my feed because maybe it was a little more catered to my show, and then the second half on Chelsea's feed. So then everyone has to listen to both. And you don't just think, okay, I heard about Chelsea, but I already kind of heard the episode here. I don't need to convert, right? So think about how you can, once you find your podcast friend, how can we work together so that maybe there's one episode that drives all of our listeners to both places? Social media and newsletter swaps. I know I said that they're not social media isn't super important, but still, you can still work with people and, shout each other out on social media and in newsletters. I think this kind of goes to something important, which is why it's good to start a newsletter, by the way, early on, because when you're doing these partnerships, you want to have something to offer, right? You're going to be asking for something. The more you have to offer, the better. So if you've been building up a social media audience, if you've been building up a newsletter or listenership, if you already have a show out, you've been building up download numbers. But if you don't have a show out, you don't have download numbers yet. That's why it's important to build up this newsletter base. So then you can say, listen, here's what I have in my inventory to share with you. I could do a social media post. I could put you in my newsletter. You're basically building a package of all of the assets you have, all of the levers that you can pull, all of the, media things that you have for your partner so that you can give them something, then you can ask for something greater in return. Guest swap. Oh my gosh, this is huge. I mean, being a guest on another podcast is huge. Sometimes people hire me just to pitch them to be on other podcasts. You should do this for yourself. I mean, depending, sometimes for certain shows it works better than others, but I would absolutely, if I was launching a show or just needed, to raise the numbers, I would get on podcasts talking about my podcast. And I'm finding more and more that people are asking, when I pitch one of my clients, they say, well, can I be on their show? And this is where it comes back to like, it'd be good if you had a newsletter or something, because sometimes my client doesn't have guests on their show. So I can't do that, or sometimes it's just not the right fit. So that doesn't always work, but it's just good if you can offer them something in return. But guest swaps are good. If you can have someone on their show, you could say, hey, would you like to be on my show? I'd love to be on your show. That's great. Another thing I would do, by the way, if you have a show or you're working on a show, okay, if there's already a lot of episodes on your show, I would go back and look at all of the guests or anyone on the show that has a podcast and go to those people. And now I used to say, go to those people and say, hey, will you drop this episode into your feed? Which is not a bad idea. But what I found was a lot of those people would just, if I did this to Chelsea, pretend Chelsea Weber Smith was on my podcast as a guest. I would go to Chelsea and say, hey, this was a great episode. They loved it. My audience loved it. Would you put it on your feed? the reason this was good was, I would do this during the holidays. Maybe Chelsea's taking a week off for Thanksgiving, and I could say, I bet you're not running anything on Thanksgiving. Why don't you run this episode? Then tell people about my podcast, Drive Them Over. But what I would find is that people would just listen and then not convert because they just love Chelsea. They'd be like, this is great, and then not convert. So what if I just instead asked Chelsea, I went through my back catalog, saw who had a podcast and said, can you do a 30-second promo for this episode? And then told people that they had to go over to my podcast to listen to it. So that's something you can do. But if you are thinking about, who you're going to be interviewing on a future podcast, I would think about podcasters. Think about people that have podcasts because they have the correct audience that you're going to be needing to grow your podcast. And then I'm just going to say working with your friends on panels, events, contact exchanges, etc. I'm podcast friends with the team at Slate, and I just was talking to them about a bunch of stuff. And they said, I said, my client Bridget Todd is going to South by Southwest. And they were like, oh my gosh, we're going to South by Southwest. We have a panel on internet culture. And I was like, oh my gosh, can Bridget be on your panel? And they said yes, and she was. So this is what I mean by podcast friendships. They take time. You have to talk to these people, ask them what they're up to, know what conferences they're going to. That's how you can really, really, really get involved in this world. Promo swaps. Now there's two kinds of promo swaps. There's the dynamic ad insertion, which most people are using these days. That means that's when you hear someone say on a podcast, like for the most part, it's like, we'll be right back, a word from our sponsor or whatever. And then you hear the ad and then they come back in. Dynamic ad insertion is great because you upload your promo. So if I was doing a promo swap with Chelsea of American Hysteria, I would say, hey, this is Lauren, you're listening to my podcast. I think you might also really like American Hysteria. Go listen to it now. Now, I could read that. That could be host read, or Chelsea could record their own promo for American Hysteria and send me the file, and I could use that. So that's the difference between host read versus pre-record. Dynamic ad insertion means I could insert that file of either me reading it or Chelsea onto the show. And with dynamic ad insertion, you can take it out after a certain number of downloads. Now, this is really good. If I'm doing a promo swap with Chelsea and we say, hey, let's do this for 50,000 downloads, I can set it on the back end so that it stops running at 50,000 downloads. And then maybe I have another promo set up and the next one will kick in once the 50,000 downloads are met. So that's what dynamic ad insertion is. Baked in means it's just, I'm reading an episode and I mention, you should listen to American Hysteria, and it's just going to be there. It's going to stay there on the episode, just like the rest of the content. And that's fine. One is not necessarily better than the other. I mean, the baked in, that means it's going to be on the podcast like forever. So that's valuable, right? So when you meet your podcast friend, you just have to go to them and negotiate, put your bartering hat on, say, you think, what do they have and what do they want? What do I have and what do I want? This is where you make your package. I'm going to put you in my social media. I'm going to put you in my newsletter. I have dynamic ad insertion. You don't. That's fine. We can still work together. Why don't you do this for 50,000 downloads? I'm going to do it baked in, whatever you think is fair. There's no right or wrong. I'm going to do 30 seconds. You're going to do 60 seconds. What if I did a feed swap with Chelsea? Well, we'll get to that in a second. But if my show is bigger, maybe, well, it's not. So Chelsea's show is bigger. So maybe I do a 60-second ad read for Chelsea and Chelsea only does a 30-second ad read for me. And remember, copy matters. Spend a lot of time on the copy that you write, okay, so to set up a promo swap, here's some advice. Before you even get started, I would write basically what 30 seconds sounds like so that you can send that copy over to your podcast friends so they know what to read. But also maybe even start with sending a list of bullet points instead, because when people read bullet points, they tend to read it in their own voice. So it sounds a little bit more natural. And if you're doing multiple promos, they're all going to sound a little bit different because everyone will interpret those bullet points a little bit differently. So you want to have that copy ready. And also you might want to have a pre-record ready in advance also, so that when someone asks for it, you can just send it over. So have that stuff ready and spend a lot of time on that copy, because think about how much time you spent on your podcast. In fact, this is just a reminder to spend a lot of time on all of the copy, the description. The copy is so important, down to the copy on the cover of your podcast. Your artwork copy needs to be important. It's so important. So this is for promo swaps. Feed swaps. I've been having so much fun with feed swaps lately. People get annoyed with them, I think, because I don't know if you follow Wondery, or I think Lemonada does this a little too much sometimes. As much as I love Lemonada shows and Lemonada everybody over there, if there's a new Lemonada show, they just blast every single Lemonada show will say new show, new show, new show, and that can be a little much, because guess what? It doesn't feel targeted. It doesn't feel special. It doesn't feel thought out. People don't mind feed swaps if they're done with intention and care and love and joy. So that means finding your podcast friend. This takes time though, right? You find your podcast friend and you say, okay, I'm going to put an episode of your show into my feed, into your feed, and vice versa. Now, I have found, I was saying with the promo swaps, people like to go number for number. Generally, we'll say 50,000 downloads for 50,000 downloads, then we'll swap it out. Or we're about the same size, so we'll do a 30-second promo for each other. But feed swaps, it's not an ad, it's just great content. So for my clients, I've been able to go to shows much bigger and secure a feed swap with them. I think it's just because it's great content and I do the work in advance. So this is how you get a feed swap with a show much bigger than yours. Do the work. Now, that means finding the perfect show that you have, the perfect episode that you have for that other podcast. So you can say, hey, I found this episode. I have this episode of mine. Your audience is going to love it. I know, and here's why. And then you have to do the research on the other side. You have to say, I would say to Chelsea, I looked through your inventory. I found this episode you have. It's going to convert my audience. They're going to love it. So you give me this one of yours, and I'm going to give you this one. That's perfect. I did the research. You're welcome. And also, by the way, Chelsea, are you taking a week off for Thanksgiving or Christmas? I bet you don't have content that week. Why don't you use it then? So I have done all this work. I'm coming with a solution to a problem, and I'm saying, you're welcome. Instead of doing a rerun, in Christmas and Thanksgiving, watch this. It's all rerun, rerun, rerun. That could be your episode instead of a rerun. So that's why you can go to shows much bigger. Also, you could mess around with the timing. If Chelsea is a lot bigger than me, maybe Chelsea only leaves it in their feed for 30 days and I have to leave mine in for much longer than that. Maybe. Also, if feed swaps make you uncomfortable, you can take them out of the feed at any time. You could say, let's leave the feed swaps in for 90 days or whatever, for 14 days, for 19 and a half days, whatever you decide, you can take it out. It's fine. You get a lot of ROI in that short amount of time. Okay, and we're running out of time, so I'm gonna speed up. But also you can switch feed swaps and promo swaps. Okay, so Chelsea's much bigger than me. What if I say, Chelsea, I'm gonna put an entire episode of your show onto my feed, and all I ask is that you do 30-second promo for me for 10,000 downloads, right? This all goes back to the fact of finding your podcast friend, thinking, what do I have? I have social media, I have newsletter, I have inventory, whatever, and working with them to come up with a good package and bartering. And that is really why it's important to find the audience first. I believe if you find the correct audience, spend a lot of time looking for the correct audience and the correct podcast friends. Because I truly believe that's really important. Once you find those people, you'll figure out something to make it work. Pitching. Now, when I say pitching, I mean, you're pitching yourself to be interviewed on another podcast. You're pitching for a promo swap. Don't email without having listened to the show. People can tell. Keep the letter short. This might be good news for you. It should be like 100 to 300 words, your pitches for whatever you're doing, even if it's trying to get you interviewed at another podcast. You don't need to tell your whole life story. You just need to get them to open the door and respond. That's it. Here's what a pitch letter looks like for me. If I'm pitching, pretend I'm pitching Chelsea Weber Smith of American Hysteria to a bunch of podcasts so that they can be interviewed. I would literally say in a few words at the top, hey, I'm working with this client. I really think you like them. Here's why. Maybe bullet points, 3 to 5 things they could talk about. Then show artwork, a picture of Chelsea, and a show description, and that's it. That is what a pitch letter looks like when it comes from me. Make sure the podcast is still running when you're pitching, all this stuff. Make sure it's one you'd recommend. Don't send a selfish letter. It's really nice if you can offer something in return. Show your value. When you're you know, emailing someone about a promo swap or something, remember you're not asking for a favor. You're saying, I did this work, I did research, and I have a solution. So keep that in mind. Oh, I wish we had more time to talk about this. Pitching to podcast newsletters is so huge. So, so huge. It's your perfect audience. Anyone dorky enough to subscribe to podcast newsletters is so obsessed with podcasts that they're going to subscribe to several things. And I can say that I have 2 podcast newsletters. I love them all. You should be pitching to podcast newsletters. Oh, and one thing, sorry, I'm going to interrupt myself for a second. A lot of this is about promo stops and sending people to other podcasts. And one time I was at Podcast Movement and someone stood up and said, why would I send someone to another podcast? I was like, I think you're in the wrong business, because that's what this is all about. Don't ever worry about sending someone to another podcast. Worry about making a good show. This is how it works. Most podcast listeners will listen to another show. So that's why we got to, I said it's hard to convert non-podcast listeners, and I don't worry about them. I worry about podcast listeners. Go after those people. They will listen to something new, and they're reading podcast newsletters. So podcast newsletters don't get pitched that much. Trust me, I know, because I have one. And they don't get a lot of good pitches. I love a personal, nice pitch. I don't get too many of them. So I have a list of podcast newsletters on one of these slides. So you can start there, just Google podcast newsletters, read them first, sign up for them, get to know what kind of things they like to write about before you pitch. James Cridlin has a great newsletter. It's huge, Pod News. He likes to write about things that are new and technology and news. You have to know that before you pitch James. My podcast newsletter, it's what I like. I like weird stuff. I like indie stuff. I like things about the Donner Party and Disney World and Jay Dilla and Jesus. And, you'll get to know that about me if you read my newsletter. So you'll know if your pitch is good or not. And one tip about when pitching, I get a lot of cold pitches that I don't have time to read them all. So but when I send out an issue of my newsletter, I read every single response, because what if I spelled something wrong? I want to make sure I didn't make a mistake and that someone's not responding to it. So what I would do is sign up for a newsletter, read a couple issues. Then instead of sending a cold pitch, write your pitch in response to an issue of the newsletter that just went out. Because when someone does that to me, it signals to me, oh, this is coming from someone in my community, someone that reads my newsletter. And it's like coming to me with my arms wide open as opposed to closed. Here's a bunch of them. Take a screenshot, or just Google, or you can see this one. I send you the deck. Start a podcast newsletter. As I said before, I think it's a really good idea. Just building up your audience. You can use it to leverage, use it, when you're working with your podcast friends. Also, I'm just going to shout out this Nudge is a podcast and a newsletter that work very well together. He always says on the podcast, and you can read the rest of my newsletter, and always makes me go read the newsletter issues. So what he's doing is putting some of the content in his podcast and some of the content in his newsletter. But if you're interested in marketing, Nudge is it's using like social science to explain how to grow things. So highly recommend Nudge. And one more thing, starting from scratch is when I get a client that is starting a podcast from scratch, that's when I actually do focus on the things that were on the left side of that toolkit that I was talking about before. It's the pitching. It's the getting that client on podcasts to be interviewed. It's the pitching to apps. It's the pitching to podcast newsletters. It's more pitching. And that's great that, what you have in your favor if you're starting something new is the buzziness, the newness. Apps love that. Newsletter writers love that. So that's what's really good. You have to use that moment. Don't lose that moment when you're starting something new. If I have a client who has been going, for a while and has a lot of inventory, that's when I focus more on the marketing stuff, where I'm going to podcast friends and saying, do a promo swap with me, do a feed swap with me, because they already have episodes and they already have inventory. So you can use a mix of both of these things, whether you're new or not. But just know, if you have a brand new show, you don't have inventory, you don't have downloads yet, so you don't have a lot to work with. So really, really lean into the fact that you're new. And it is 12 o'clock on the dot. Thank you. And I haven't been looking at your faces or the chat. I've been focused on all this. So I can't tell if people are horrified or if there were a bunch of questions in the chat, or if people are crying or upset or bored, or if people completely left altogether. So hi, hope everyone's doing okay. And I'm here for some questions.
No one is horrified. It was wonderful. I think we were all furiously writing notes, but also I know that there's lots that got recorded and can be shared so people can look back at it. Thank you so much. I think that was incredible. I know that you didn't have much time and you had a lot to cover, but it was an amazing kind of overall insight. So thank you. We have got one question so far. People are saying this was awesome, just so you know, so you can see in the chat. So do you mind if I dive in, Lauren, with the first question that we've got? So hopefully you don't mind me reading your name, Kimberly. So Kimberly says, I have a show. It is via a community radio platform in upstate New York. We do not know who is listening. I have Facebook followers for the show. How do I get them to convert to a podcast or YouTube?
So you want the Facebook people to convert to the podcast, is that correct? The
Yeah.
Facebook followers. Okay. I mean, it is tricky because the people on Facebook, they might not necessarily be podcast listeners. So I think, I mean, that's one reason I don't focus on Facebook that much. But I think, what's working on Facebook now, short video is working. Maybe if you could make some video, it doesn't even have to be your face. It could be like a really easy audiogram. Headliner is a tool that I use to make audiograms that's really nice, and they have a lot of free options. So I would do some stuff with Headliner and use that on Facebook. I also think if I really was going to lean into my Facebook, what's working at Facebook now is groups. So if you could get the kind of, because what I said about social media is it's good for the community you're building. So you're building a community. So how can you get these people to talk to one another? Why is my hand raised? Whatever. Get people to talk to one another, maybe start a group, also maybe bring people's Facebook comments into the show and say, hey, I'm going to answer your question on my podcast. Or, as a podcast listener, I always want to hear my question or my name on a podcast. So maybe that's what you're doing. You're asking them for the content or helping them make the show. What episode do you think I should do next? Your opinion matters to me. So then just, I think, involving them, asking them questions, and then building a community around them. Does that help?
Yes. May I ask one more question? Because you did mention Spotify and Apple. If there was just one or two, are you saying those are the two go-to ones? Platforms to be on, because there's like what, 8 to 10?
I mean, you should be on all of them.
Oh, okay.
Every single platform. I should mention that for sure. Because it's just so easy to get on all of them. And I can't explain, I feel like if you upload to Apple, it will go on all of them. But I'm really glad you brought this up because I thought of another tip. So you should be on all of them. It's no skin off your nose to be off all of them. It takes 1 second to get on all of them. Most like Buzzsprout or whatever platform you're using will distribute them on all of them. It's for you. It shouldn't be a huge lift, and you really, really need to be on all of them. But it reminds me of something. So I didn't talk about social media too much on purpose, but if you are on social media and if you are linking from a newsletter, in fact, if you're linking from anywhere, you don't want to just use one platform's link. Like for example, you don't want to just use your Apple Podcast. Don't ever send someone your Apple Podcast link unless you know that they listen on Apple Podcasts. Because what if you had a newsletter and you put your Apple Podcast link in your newsletter? What if I don't have an iPhone? Then I'm going to have a bad experience and I might just like never listen again. So what I would do is there is this website called pod.link or episodes. Is it episodes.fm? You can do this right now if you want. It's called episodes.fm. Let's try that. Episodes.fm or pod.link. You type in your show or a show, and this beautiful page will look like a little website. And if you'll notice, all of the buttons of all the players are at the top. This is what you should send people to, because then if I have an iPhone, if I prefer I listen on Pocket Casts. So anything that can get me closer to the Pocket Cast button is better. It has more likely chance I'm going to stick with you. So that is what I would use to get on when you're distributing, but you really should be on all these anyway. But this is a good way to check if you are, look up your show in pod.link and then look and click on every single one and make sure you're in all those buttons, because that's what people are using to listen on. One more thing about Pocket Casts. Does anyone listen on Pocket Casts? I wonder. I have found it is like a lot of, in the US anyway, the biggest podcast nerds listen on Pocket Casts. And it's actually something interesting to think about which app your listeners are listening on. Because a lot of like true crime, like larger podcasts that might be Apple, more men are on Spotify. I'm making humongous statements here that aren't always true, but like, there's things that you will find. And I think a lot of like indie, more fiction, Pocket Cast, that's what I use. But Pocket Cast is much smaller, but it has a newsletter. I would subscribe to it like ASAP because, well, it's like a marketing newsletter. They only put out one issue a month. And it literally says in that issue, it says, do you have a podcast? They put in the newsletter what they're going to be featuring the next month. And if they say, would you like me to feature you? All you have to do is respond to be featured. And it's literally a person. Her name is M. She's amazing. Tell her I said hi. And you have a great chance of being featured in Pocket Casts. I don't think people know about this newsletter. I don't think people subscribe to this newsletter, but it really is that simple. So that's another tip. Wow, I got so far away from that question. I apologize.
I think people are loving it.
Okay.
Would you mind putting your last slide back up? Because I think people were trying to write down your email address but didn't
Oh, sure.
manage. Maybe
I'll
we can just
also
keep it up for a bit, or put your email address in the chat, whichever is easier for you.
that's my email
Oh,
address.
perfect. Thank you. Another question, if I can go to it, Lauren, is for someone who's talking specifically about a podcast that is a limited series, so set number of episodes, all of them have been released, the run is finished. Katie is asking, do you think there's still value in trying to, for example, find feed swaps or cross promotion opportunities for a podcast that's already kind of done?
100 zillion%. It's going to be most people are concerned it's brand new, right? That have never heard it. I will say though, yes, the answer is yes. That episode is going to be good. It is going to be good for a feed swap. People don't even have to know that when it was released. So for feed swaps, for promo swaps, it's never too late to bring people to that show. Never. It's never too late to pitch to, newsletters, is if you can think of a hook. Or, that's the thing, podcast, the newsletter, I talk about shows that are old all the time. So depending on the newsletter, you could even be pitching to newsletters. However, I would say if you can, if the newsletter or if the podcast hasn't had an episode since the last year, I would always try to have something. And maybe that's a feed swap, maybe that you're doing, but just some episode that shows up in that year, because it's like a visual thing. Like when people see that there hasn't been an episode since last year, it's weird. People think it's not the end of the world, but I think it just helps if you have something there. Maybe it's even just if you have the power to do this, coming on the mic and checking in with people or talking about an old episode or having a chat with someone or something. If you can have something a little bit newer, that's good, but it doesn't matter. I once worked with a podcast it was a fiction podcast that was done, and they had hired a bunch of expensive actors to do the reading and stuff that wouldn't come back to do any sort of promotion. Okay. I don't even know why I took on this client. It was a good show. That's why it's called City of Ghosts. That's why I took it on. It seemed impossible. I was like, what am I going to do? So here's what I did. How do I grow this show? They wanted to turn it into a movie and they wanted to get acquired by a network. That was their goal. So what I did was I made another episode. I got someone that writes about audio to interview the director. So that was its own episode where this person came on and interviewed the director. That was a separate episode. I put feed swaps on either side and I did a promo read on that episode with the director. So I had 2 feed swaps going on. I had the promo on the episode with the director, and then I pitched to the apps and it had beautiful artwork. And listen, that's really important. I think it really helped for this show. City of Ghosts has beautiful artwork. So it got boosted in the charts. It got all this work from these feed swaps I was doing, and it got acquired by Realm. So there was a happy story about something where for a second, I thought there's nothing I can do. The lesson there is there's something you can do almost always.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Casey says that's massively helpful. Thank you. Any other questions? Does anyone want to raise their hand and just ask their question verbally, or any more that anyone wants to write into the chat? I'll just wait a few minutes. While we're waiting, I might just say that one of the things that really helped me, Lauren, is when you were saying that speak directly to your listeners. So the bit when you were saying about text this to a friend who needs cheering up, or text that, it's like just those specific call outs, I thought was so helpful and just really useful. So thank you.
Glad to hear it. Yeah, last year I did this thing where I was like, people don't leave enough ratings and reviews. It's free. It takes 2 seconds. They don't do it enough. So I was like, every day for last year, I left a rating and review and I tweeted it out to keep myself accountable every day. But guess what I learned doing that it's harder than you think, because sometimes I don't have time. I just want to do it. That's when I was like, it would be helpful if these shows were like, you don't have to write an essay about how much you love me. You don't have to write an award-winning review. You don't have, just say your favorite Taylor Swift song. That would have been enough.
I love it. 100%. Well, as far as I can see, I don't think there are many more questions, but as you've kindly given your email, you might be inundated with questions that way. So I will just stop our recording.